You're listening to Breaking BizDev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Hello, business developers, and welcome back to another episode of Breaking BizDev. I'm John, and I'm joined by my trusty co-host, Mark Wainwright. Mark, we're going to beat up a topic today that we've talked about a few times in the past, but I think we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive on this one, this whole salesman alter ego. I'm excited to unpack this one with you.
Absolutely. This is so fascinating. And I think the reason we wanted to go deeper was both you and I have had conversations. I mean, we had some guest voices on the podcast, and they brought up two people, one of whom we haven't actually kind of had on the podcast previously. Well, I guess both we had. One's a new voice that we introduced today, Mel, to the podcast, but both talk about similar things. And in conversations, both on the podcast and outside of the podcast, we've recognized that this weird alter ego thing, multiple people recognize it and see it. And I've seen it. And when we had those guest voices come in, that was kind of an aha moment for me. And I thought, oh my gosh, other people actually see this.
Yeah, it's a pattern that you once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. And it's like, I think to like examples in movies that I've seen, Danny DeVito and Matilda. I know I've used that example before, but I think it's a great one where he's running the miles back on his car, right?
Yeah.
To reverse the mileage because he's a used car salesman. And we when we're selling expertise-based services, we kind of lean back until this like default state of what is sales and what are sales habits that you've seen. I think that's kind of what we're getting into today. Right.
Yeah, we're gonna talk a bit about that whole default setting, and I use that term on and off when in the work that I do, because particularly when we're in the world of expertise, and I'm talking to people who are engineers, consultants, architects, all those experts, but they're not experts in selling their services, right? So when we find ourselves as an expert at the edge or slightly beyond our comfort zones, when we're kind of pushing the edge of things and the ground below us gets a little shaky, we want to default back to, or we don't want to necessarily, but we sort of kind of automatically default back to some sort of known thing. And a lot of times in selling services, people will default back to these really strange, salesy behaviors that they picked up somewhere, right?
Well, I think it's interesting because if you're a doer seller, let's say you're an architect or an accountant, and you're used to having the answers, right? You're used to being sought out. Your expertise is in demand. You're the one who has the answers. You can solve a complex problem. During the sales process, it's kind of hard to kind of like take yourself out of that mindset of being the expert. And I think that plays into it a little bit.
I will see this. I know we're kind of all over the place on this because it's such a fascinating topic, but I'll see this crop up kind of all over the place early on, later on. Effectively, what we see happening is all of these behaviors that people despise in general, that they look at and they say, oh, I don't want to be that. Lo and behold, we see those kind of manifest at some point, which is so strange, so fascinating, actually. And the two voices we have on the podcast today reiterate that, and yeah, I love it. So maybe we can talk for a second before we get to those about what characteristics are we talking about?
Experts, accountants, architects, engineers, consultants, these folks are in a position where they're usually, providing answers or recommendations to solutions, solving challenges. And so I think there is the characteristic of talking a little bit more than listening, because the expert sale is very much centered around understanding challenges and qualifying opportunities. And so I think that's one that I've noticed
Yeah.
in certain scenarios.
Yeah. I would agree. And it's definitely one of those sort of hindsight things. I mean, I'll talk to people and I'll say, well, how did the conversation go? And oh, it went fine. And, as I dig into it, one of the questions I'll ask folks is that, look, who did the majority of the talking? And it's like, well, we kind of did an intro and then we pulled out the slide deck and we started doing that. And I said, if you talked for 45 minutes of the 60 minutes, that's a problem, right? Particularly in sales where it's, it needs to be based in inquiry and listening. So yeah, that happens, and it'll happen without even people realizing it. I'm like, wait, oh my gosh, you're right.
When did you first kind of realize that, Mark? Like, when did you first notice that within yourself?
Not that long ago. Quite frankly, when I first started out selling services, I was lousy at it. I was everything that doesn't work. I was the show up and throw up. I was the show them the deck. I was, what are we going to talk about? What expertise are we going to tout? What resumes and certifications are we going to show? We're going to show up at this big Wild West gunfight with the biggest 6-shooter out there and just level the competition. And it wasn't until kind of recent history where I started to see that and then see more of it in me. And then from there, be able to start to change. So absolutely, in the last, ever since I started doing what I was doing, which was about, 8+ years ago or so, it really wasn't until I was able to kind of step outside myself and look at my history, look at what I'd done in the past, and start to really understand what it means to sell well, where I started to recognize that. So yeah, it was recent history. I was not a good salesperson of services, and I think that helped me, because I was the talk about yourself all the time person. And now I can really look back on that and say, oh yeah, what I'm doing right now is radically different from that. Mm-hmm. What I help people do is radically different from that.
I wonder, were you in organizations that were on that RFP hamster wheel, as we like to say?
Well, yes. And I was. Some of the firms that I worked with previously, as an employee, I was part of that whole hamster wheel, and I was making proposals look like brochures and, all of that stuff. And I didn't know any different. And then I moved to a management consulting firm where very rarely did we entertain
it's a bit of a different
those solicitations, but still, everything looked like, a show, a production. There was the pitch, and there was all of that, and there was no order to a sales process, and there was, it was chaos. So at least from my
the reason I ask is because, like, I'm just wondering if that competitive scenario, like you mentioned earlier, you said, like, level the competition, right?
Yeah.
You're showing up and you want to win. And I'm wondering if that kind of like feeds into that mindset, that this alter ego that we're talking about, this concept of winning. And we've talked about how sales is not a zero-sum game, but to some it might appear that way.
Right.
I'm wondering, what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's that what you just talked through right there feeds into that whole, we're not engaged in this process to be focused on the client, to come up with the best solution for the client, which, is a win-win for everybody. We are focused on the competition, and we want to level the competition. And yes, it is a zero-sum game, and we're going to win and they're going to lose.
Right.
So it's that mindset. And there's layers of problems, a lack of client centricity, too much time spent and too much focus spent on the competition, of which little about, and so there's that absolutely, that whole zero sum sort of, we're competing against them rather than we're trying to find the best way to serve the client. That is pervasive.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about some characteristics, talks more than listens. They have all the answers. Are there others, Mark, other characteristics of this kind of like alter ego salesman alter ego?
Right. The and people that know me, and we've talked about this kind of endlessly, John, is the ability to ask really good questions. And the coming up with really good questions to ask your prospective clients is more difficult than just talking about yourself, right? It's harder, so people don't do it as much. The fantastic thing about these good questions, if you really think hard and you're able to come up with fantastic questions, they do a good job of implying your expertise rather than you needing to be explicit about your expertise, showing the bullet points, showing the certifications and the years of experience, et cetera. Your good questions will infer that to the degree where the client comes out of the conversation thinking, wow, they know their stuff, without even you having to be, kind of overtly, explicit about it. So, and that's a hard one. And people prioritizing the development of good questions over the pitch is a tough nut for a lot of experts to swallow. They say, wait, we're really not going to go in there, with our flags waving and, talking about our decades of experience. And I said, you're not. You're going to spend the time right now coming up with really fantastic questions to ask this client, because it's more important to know that you're focused on them and you're curious about them and you want to get them, rather than they seeing your list of 40 services and your decades of expertise. It's more important that you just get them, and they need to see that.
Outside of these characters, it's like, why do they arise? Right. And so, we talked a little bit about, being exposed to poor examples of what a salesperson is, and then emulating those behaviors by default. I suppose that this kind of same phenomenon could happen in other aspects of people's lives.
We mentioned before when we were talking about this that you've seen your podcast persona rear its ugly head. I've probably seen it in, heck, I don't know, even thinking outside our subject matter here. It's parenting, all different kinds of things. Like parents can default to these really strange behaviors with their children. I mean, reflecting on that personally, I have 2 older children now who are now young adults, and my wife's a preschool teacher. So, she's a pro at all of this. So I can absolutely recall different moments, different behaviors that I exhibited that, why, look back on that and I'm thinking, wow, why was I being such a jerk dad? How could I have approached that situation completely differently that, wouldn't have had me sort of just defaulting to these weird behaviors? And, I have a fantastic relationship with my family, but yeah, I mean, there's moments that come up where you don't really know what to do, or, the reaction or the behavior in the moment is unclear. So you default to some weird thing.
Similarly, in my career, I've spent just trying to understand, what is good marketing. And I keep bumping into this notion of like tactical empathy and really putting yourself in your buyer's shoes at scale with marketing. When we're talking about with sales, it's definitely more one-on-one, but we can take those same principles and we can apply them to like broader marketing. I found myself in the early days of hosting an interview-based podcast where if I'm talking with a guest and they say something that is at odds with my own predispositions, my own biases, I kind of found myself like digging my heels in a little bit and getting into more of a defensive posture. But as I've kind of learned that in those conversations, it's better to approach it with an open mind and curiosity, because that's how you extract value to your listeners. That I'm kind of like connecting dots between podcasting and selling. There's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah. And hopefully the listeners can make some similar connections in their own personal experiences, whether it's in marketing or selling your services or, elsewhere in their lives. It's this whole weird thing of, when we're at the edge of our comfort zones, we find that we kind of unconsciously default back to these behaviors, and hopefully the behaviors are good, but often they're not. And that's a huge problem. You're listening to Breaking BizDev,
the podcast that beats up, breaks down, and redefines business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. Your hosts are John Tyerman, founder of Red Cedar Marketing, the podcast marketing company for experts and professional services firms,
and Mark Wainwright, principal consultant and founder of Wainwright Insight, the fractional sales manager and sales consultant to professional services firms.
If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by following the show and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts.
And now, back to the show.
Yeah, so we've got some guest voices I want to get to. Yeah, so first I want to introduce Mel Lester. He is a fellow Virginian. Shout out to VA. He is the owner of BizEdge. He's a management consultant and trainer focused on helping firms improve a wide range of corporate functions like strategic planning, leadership development, operational efficiency, project management, and more. Mark, we both kind of know Mel independently, and it was fun to finally kind of sit down with him and have this conversation. And he brought up many of the points that we're making right now. So here comes Mel.
When I do sales training, typically I will open with by posing this question. If I mention the word salesperson, what impressions immediately come to mind?
Yeah.
And as you might expect, they're overwhelmingly negative. And when you take the comments and boil them down, I think one trait emerges, and that is the perception that most salespeople are motivated more by their own self-interest than the interest of the buyer. Now, and so that begs the question, when you're asked as a technical professional to step into a sales role as a seller-doer, how do those impressions of salespeople affect you? I have noticed two problems. The first is that most professionals in our business are uncomfortable with the sales role. They may not always admit it, but most have this discomfort with the role. And given their, how they view salespeople, that's no surprise. Why would you want to be one of those? And then that gets us back to the age-old challenge of how do I get our seller doers to do more selling? Well, the big part of it is, among all the other excuses that might be offered, is I just don't really like to be in that role. Now, the second problem is an odd contradiction. I've been on, over the years, hundreds of sales calls with technical professionals. And here's what I observed. Most often, they adopt many of the same tactics that they resent in salespeople. It would be things like talk too much, focus on themselves rather than the client, don't really listen very well. So why would they do that?
Right.
It's because they don't know anything else. That's what they have observed, that even though they may not like it, there's this underlying assumption that this must be the way you have to sell. And that gets back to the issue why the people want to then, I don't like to do it, let's hire a salesperson. They think that that's the persona that we need to have to sell. And so it creates this vicious cycle that I don't like, this image of selling, and yet when I'm in the sales role, I don't know what else to do except to do that. And so it's a mindset problem. And that's something you got to get in and address, this mindset about what selling looks like and what motivates us to sell. And you need to address that mindset problem, in my opinion, before you can really have success teaching a specific sales methodology. Mindset before methodology. So here's my advice to seller doers. Stop selling and start serving. If our business development efforts are primarily for the benefit of our firm and for us, well, join the crowd. That's where most folks are. But if you want to distinguish yourself and gain greater trust from clients, then define business development as seeking more opportunities to serve, namely clients. And so if we need to recast this role of seller to not just doing it motivated by our own needs, which is what is natural to fall into. We had the pressure to go out and sell, right? We need the business. And I need to be successful as a seller doer. But what I found is the best path to success as a seller is to focus on those that you are approaching with offering to help.
Okay. Yeah. Some of the images that come to mind when you're talking about, talking too much or having that kind of salesperson persona, Glengarry, Glen Ross, coffees for closers, right?
Right.
And or always be closing, some of these like cliches, horrible
Yeah.
examples of, what sales really is. So, let's contrast that a little bit. What are some of maybe you could just list a couple, what are some of the qualities of a salesperson who is seeking to serve their clients? What are some of the habits or activities that you notice?
I think one of the things is that you focus on more than just what's the service offering, which is our tendency. It's what we know best. And focus on how can this contribute to the client achieving their business outcomes. And so taking this broader view, this broader interest in what it is that is what, as the old, you may have heard the old example that people aren't looking for a 1/4-inch drill bit. They're looking for a 1/4-inch hole.
Right.
And too often what we find ourselves doing is we're selling the drill bit because that's what we have, rather than what is it the client needs. They need the hole. And so to be able to sort of frame what we have to offer in the context of what the client needs to achieve their goals, which is something we don't often do.
So it sounds like it's an exercise in empathy and understanding.
Yes.
And really putting yourself in the shoes of your clients to see things from their perspective. Sure, the drill may be the tool that is used to create the hole, but that's not what the client needs.
Right. And I
Okay.
think another factor that when I began to embrace this approach, because when I started in a sales role as a business development specialist, I very much approached it like traditional sellers. That's all I knew until I began to really examine. I remember driving to work one day and I had this epiphany. I hated my job. I either had to change the way I approached selling or I had to find something else to do. And so when I began to take this sort of service oriented approach, one of the things that became sort of a mantra for me is never waste the client's time. And I realized that I did that a lot because a lot of times, sales calls would be based upon my needs. Well, I haven't talked to him in a while. I need to talk to him again. Or the famous, I'm going to be up in your area because I was out in the Rocky Mountain region. So sometimes you had to travel quite a distance to meet with a client. And so you're going to Green River, Wyoming, 4 hours away. So while you're there, you want to see as many people maybe as you can.
Sure.
And so it'd be my convenience. And then you go in and what do? Chit chat and just to touch bases. In fact, we had that sort of dialogue or that term that we use, touching bases with in a sales context. Well, for what reason?
Right.
For what benefit to the client? And so I came up with this idea and really borrowed a lot of what I came up with from some of the sales training I received is the idea of having a business-minded reason for every conversation I had with the client, something for their benefit.
Okay.
I call it the entree, the reason, what you have information or insights to share that are beneficial to the client, whether or not they ever do business with you. So you bring something of value to every sales conversation. That to me is kind of the driver for taking this sort of service-centered approach to selling. is you bring something of value to every conversation that you would have with the buyer.
So you were in a position where you hated your job and you found inspiration to adopt this new behavioral mindset and kind of flip the script a little bit and thinking of things through the client's point of view. And how do you feel about your career from that point to now? Do you enjoy selling?
I think the best way to put it is I enjoy serving. That's the greatest motivation I have for what I do, is the opportunity to help my clients.
Mark, what did you think of what Mel had to say?
So good. I'm nodding the whole time, right? All that whole sort of self-orientation thing where people talk too much and they're poor listeners, and why do they do that? Well, they don't know anything else, right? They're those default behaviors. And the big idea here is just, man, it's just, he's seen it. Mel's been around a while, right? He's a long timer, so he's seen a lot of this. And this is one of those, when you shared that recording with me, I said, wow, he and I are totally simpatico on this. We are aligned. He's seen it. I've seen it. It's wild.
Yeah, what stood out to me when talking with Mel was how much he just disliked sales at first. It was painful for him. But when he kind of reoriented his mindset and thought about it more as serving the customer rather than selling to someone, that mindset shift helped him, reframe that. And he's had a successful 30+ year career as an independent business owner, independent management consultant. So, these are definitely sage words of advice.
Yeah, the part we said he just hated his job, and he either needed to change the way he did things or find another job. Right? He was like, I just can't stand day in and day out coming in and doing this. It just doesn't feel right. And then he made that mindset shift, and that whole sort of stop selling, start serving thing just nailed it. Yeah, absolutely. So great. Thanks a ton, Mel.
Yes, thank you, Mel. Should we shift to the other clip that we have?
Absolutely. And this is one from Blair Enns that we've featured at least part of Blair's.
I think we ran part of this clip on an earlier episode.
Yeah. We featured some of this, and Blair's actually written about it. I read about this a long time ago. He has an article on his Win Without Pitching site. Really great source of information. I think the article is called something like The Dichotomy of the Expert Salesperson. Mm-hmm. So it's a good read. Absolutely. People should check it out.
All right, here comes Blair.
Blair, what's one thing you think is completely broken about the way firms go about developing new business?
I think it's the stereotypes around the greater sales function. We don't even call it sales, right? Mm-hmm. We call it new business or business development. And there's a lot wrapped up in there. I've kind of built a business around on that friction. You've got this expert advisor or practitioner of some kind, a professional who's expected to show up in the engagement a certain way. And then when they go into sales mode or business development mode, they adopt a different personality. We're all kind of constrained by these fallacies of how we think salespeople should behave. Like the salesperson should have the answer, not the question. The salesperson has to be brilliant, has to always have know exactly what to say. There's just too many statements, not enough questions, too much pressure to be somebody or not. So I see it as David and I did a podcast episode on it. I've written a blog post on it. I call it The Dichotomy of the Expert Salesperson. You're an expert first and a salesperson second, and then you adopt these sales techniques that might be applicable in other domains and are not applicable. I'm not saying not everything. Like there are some aspects of selling that are universal, but what's broken is the assumption that expertise of any kind can and should be sold same way that products are sold or transactional services are sold. Drop the salesperson persona, be yourself, do what David said, which is like pick one or two things and just be consistent.
Mark, I think that these are two, great other voices that are supporting this whole notion that this alter ego salesperson is killing the expert driven sale. And, I think you and I have talked a lot about different ways that experts can take a different approach to business development.
Yeah, absolutely. And the first step that anyone needs to take, I've taken it, others have taken it. The first step that people need to take in this whole process is people need to see it first. You need to be able to almost,
in themselves or in others.
Right. In yourself, right? You need to be able to almost, take yourself out of yourself, right? That whole sort of, I'm floating above myself in the room, watching myself talk, behave, whatever else.
You can listen back to your call recordings.
Yeah. If you're able to see it in yourself and see those behaviors, then you can start to change it. But until you actually see it, you're going to have a tough time changing it. So that's the first step. The first step is not just, I'm going to start behaving differently. It's being able to see in yourself some of these default behaviors, regardless of what they are, and recognize them, and then start to understand ways to act differently.
Yeah. And it's so uncomfortable to do that and to do that kind of introspection. Listening to myself, editing my own podcast audio, sometimes it's like nails on a chalkboard to me. But, doing that over and over again, I'm able to, hear myself and learn and grow. And it's kind of that same phenomenon that happens where, you have to step outside of your comfort zone in order to even take that first step to look back at yourself.
Yeah.
It's easy to just say, push that off. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to listen to the call recordings. I'm not going to ask for any feedback on that last sales call. Right. I'm not going to have somebody sit in and give me feedback. Those are examples of how you can, take that first step, but it's hard to do that.
Agreed. This has been a fantastic episode. I'm certain there are listeners out there who, upon reflection, maybe have seen or see some of these behaviors kind of crop up, and hopefully this helps people recognize them and then start to seek ways to change that. So fantastic episode, John. I really enjoyed this, and thanks to Mel and Blair for adding their voices to the Breaking BizDev podcast. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking BizDev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.